Hello, Peter Hill. Do you hear and see us?
I can hear you. I can see you. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, you're over there.
Yeah.
Is that a yes?
Yeah. Yes, Peter. We're welcome. You give a thumbs up. We like that. So first of all, I don't think many of you have met with Peter before. So Peter deserves a bit of introduction. So I think I'll start. Peter has worked in the UK government for 25 years. And also doing that, he's been serving the European Commission as advisor to the Trade Commissioner, Peter Mandelson. And for those of you who don't know Peter Mandelson, he's the current US ambassador in the USA. And going back to Peter Hill, he was the director of strategy in the UK Foreign Ministry for 4 years and was the head of the Prime Minister's office for 4 years, as well as working as the UK lead negotiator for G7 and G20. And before leaving the government, Peter was also the CEO of the UN Climate Summit, COP26. And as of today, Peter works as senior advisor to PwC, both in domestic and international politics, as well as in industries as climate and energy. And he's also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. And I can say, we are very, very pleased to have you here, Peter, as our prominent guest. So the scene is yours, and I urge the audience, please pay attention.
Great, thank you so much, Niklas. And I should just emphasize that the views I'm giving are mine. They don't bind PwC, as I suspect will become clear as we go through this. So let's try the clicker and hope that this works. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about the geopolitical position and the macroeconomic situation, starting with the biggest change factor in the world at the moment, which is Donald J. Trump, which I think this slide makes clear. The implications of the decisions being taken by the United States at the moment are significant, not only for the United States but for the world as a whole. So I'm going to talk about the approach of the United States, impact on tariffs, of course, and the motivations behind that, the impact on the rest of the world. I will talk about the security implications, particularly for Europe, and then perhaps a little bit on the outlook for Russia, Ukraine, and maybe one or two words of positive news on the UK-EU relationship. So let's check the slide is working. Great. So what is Donald Trump? Donald Trump is a producer and a product of a disrupted world. He was brought to power partly because of Joe Biden's weak campaign and decision to leave late, but above all by the cost of living and immigration. He is causing further disruption, and I will go through the areas where that's particularly prominent. But I just want to lodge one point, which is that although he is extremely disruptive, there's also continuity in the United States. Whoever won last year's election, the United States has been becoming more protectionist. Immigration has been rising up the agenda as a concern, and the attention of the United States has been turning towards the Asia-Pacific region. So it's important to bear that in mind, that although he's a disruption, he's not a complete aberration. So let's move on. Those of us, I dealt with a lot with Donald Trump in his first term. He's different in his second term, and those differences matter. He's much more confident than he was in his first term. He's obviously much better prepared. If you look at that chart, you can see just how many executive orders he has introduced. He has people who want to enable and amplify him, not people who are trying to constrain him. In his first term, there were many people working to manage Donald Trump, and often in collaboration with international governments in Europe and the United Kingdom. That is not the case for this term. And he is largely unopposed and unconstrained by the normal checks and balances of the US Constitution. The congressional Democrats are compliant. The Democrats are nowhere. And you can see that the private sector is pretty careful about what it says and does. The constraint at the moment comes from the courts, and the relationship between the administration and the courts is going to be a source of tension this year, and I think for the duration of this presidency. Let's try the next slide. There we go. Obviously, tariffs is something we have to talk about. The president has long been, as long as I have known him, a fan of tariffs for various reasons. Tariffs were increased slightly in his first term. They increased in a targeted way under Biden. But under Trump, they have scaled up enormously. And US trade policy is essentially reverting over 100 years to where it was at the end of the last century. And he's achieved most of that without a vote in Congress. He's used emergency economic powers, and Congress has not sought to stop him. There are a number of mechanisms that he will, and I think can use with Congress. But for now, he is doing this without congressional restriction. So where are we so far? I mean, I'm sure those of you who are affected by individual tariffs are following them very closely, but overall, it's an extremely moving and confusing picture. So this slide just tries to summarize where we are. The most significant is obviously the so-called reciprocal tariffs, the customized tariffs, which were announced on the beginning of April and then were postponed on the 9th of April. But it's quite, as you can see, a significant change. Steel and aluminium car parts, which are in force, and a baseline tariff of 10%, which is also in force, even though the customized tariffs are not. And the most significant is the essential ending, if continued, of trade between the United States with a level of tariffs between the two. Next slide. How others respond is at least as important as what the United States does. So China has responded with 125% tariffs, with export controls on products and minerals that are important to the United States, and with action against US companies. These are much higher than any of us expected. I'll come in a moment to why that might be. If they are maintained, they will not only the de-risking that both the United States and the EU have talked about for many years, but they will effectively throttle trade, direct trade between China and the United States. Canada, the EU, I won't go through every country, but Canada and the EU have said they will respond. They are looking for reasons not to, because of the damage they know it will do. But if they are forced to, I'm pretty sure that both the EU and Canada will respond. What's the good news? What have we learnt through the tariff process in the last few weeks? It's that there are constraints on Trump, even if they don't come from within the United States system. They're primarily the bond market. There's some supply chains with Canada and Mexico are so embroiled that is a level of self-harm that he's been very wary of. And in response to particular lobbying, he has changed tack on a number of issues. But it was the bond market reaction on the 9th of April, which led him in the run up to the 9th of April, which led him to backtrack there. And I think that is one of the most important constraints that he faces. I don't think for a minute anyone should believe that his attachment to tariffs as an economic policy and foreign policy tool has diminished. Next slide, if we can get that. Great. So the bad news about the U-turn is it actually made the average US effective tariff higher. Donald Trump, unwittingly, I think, because of his backtracking on the rest of the world, felt obliged to increase the tariffs on China, who were responding. And as a result, the net result is a higher level of US effective tariff than it would have been without the backtracking. So as you can see from this chart, there's been a more than tenfold increase in the US effective tariff rate since last year. Let's move on. One of the problems we're all facing, I think, is that there is a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the policy of the United States in relation to tariffs. Sometimes the administration says that these are meant to address unfair trading practices. The implication of that is that if countries change their trading practices and reduce their barriers, both regulatory and at the border, the United States will lift its tariffs, i.e., you can do a deal. On the other hand, the administration and the president in particular, let's move to the next slide, The president in particular, sorry, I think we've skipped forward, says that they are intended to domesticate business and raise funds for Donald Trump's tax cuts. His biggest priority this year is to pass his budget, which cuts taxes, increases the debt ceiling without blowing the budget and triggering a gilt market crisis. So how does he do that? Well, he claims that he's going to shrink the size of the state and that he's going to tax foreigners, not US companies. I'm not justifying that. I'm simply saying that will be his argument in order to fund the tax cuts. If that's the position, then the tariffs cannot be temporary. They must be permanent, and they must be relatively significant. Otherwise, they don't encourage the domestication of business, and they don't raise enough money. And the confusion in policy is leading to quite a lot of difficulties for countries who are trying to navigate and work out what the United States actually wants. And that reflects differences within the administration. Depending on the day, you will hear a different version of this. And depending on who is in the room with the president at key moments, depends on which bit of that policy is in the ascendancy. And as I say, for some in the administration, this is not only about tariffs, this is about a fundamental reordering of the international trading system and about the US economy, making it much less of the consumer of last resort in the world economy, and I would say more protectionist. As I say, lots of frustration. You hear it from all trading partners. Everyone I talk to who's been negotiating with the United States is finding it frustrating to work out what they actually want. What do I think is going to happen? I think there will be some deals before the 90-day period expires at the beginning of July. We're very likely to see one announced today between the United Kingdom and the United States, more likely to be a sort of heads of terms than a detailed agreement. The administration needs some deals. The president has said that the world is coming crawling to the US to do deals. And so he's set an expectation that there will be some. So I think he needs to do some. So I would expect at least a handful to be done over the next few weeks. I don't think that will be dozens because of the complexity of trying to achieve that and the uncertainty about what the US wants. It doesn't look like the 10% tariff baseline is up for grabs overall. So I think some movement, but will be limited. I expect to see. There's a high likelihood, I think, of some of the delay being rolled over. Feels to me at the moment unlikely that China is going to be part of that deal in that window. Probably the same true of the European Union, but we live in hope. And it's not the end of it. Even if there is an agreement on the current phase, there will be more tariff announcement coming. So we had in the past few days announcements on tariffs on non-US films. There are investigations through the normal route going on into semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. He's been clearer on the list. So I don't think this is an issue that will be solved, and I think we will continue to face tariff tool being used over the course of certainly the coming months and probably beyond. He wants to do a deal with China if he can, but he's slightly boxed in by his own approach at the moment. Donald Trump is not a hawk on China in the way that many of his administration are. He would like to do an economic deal with China. He does not see China as a strategic threat in the way that other administrations have done, but he is at the moment in a position where he'd like to, but he has boxed himself in. China knows this is playing hardball, partly because they don't understand what the United States wants. They're finding it unpredictable, and they're not sure they can rely on any deal done. So they're taking a tough approach, but open to discussion. And I don't think they will rush to do a deal myself, but the economic pain means that they will want to find an agreement if they can. But as I say, I do not think that will be rapid. So what does this mean overall for China? I think the Chinese have a mixed view of this administration. They're quite confused by it. They see that there's a fundamental shift in the US approach to China and the number of China hawks in the administration. They have noted Trump's economic policies are undoubtedly a threat to Chinese growth and make it harder to achieve China's 5% growth target. And therefore, they will want to find answers, both domestic and international, to those. Trump overall has some opportunities for China. He is disinterested in European security. He is not concerned about China's dominance of East Asia in the way that previous administrations have been, or about China's growing influence in the rest of the world to the same extent that others are. He's not particularly interested in defending Taiwan for strategic reasons. Obviously, for the moment, they're needed for semiconductors. And his withdrawal from multilateral institutions is creating opportunities for China. So it's a mixed picture for China, but in strategic terms, there are opportunities for them. Things to watch. Predicting what's going to happen is extremely difficult, given that many of the decisions lie with one man who's influenced by often the latest person he's spoken to. I think the things to watch I've listed here: the gilt yields growth, inflation, public opinion. In the immediate term, it's the gilt which have been most influential. Inflation, that concerns him, but he will blame the Fed for that. Public opinion over time will concern him, but I think he's demonstrated that he will put up with a bit of concern in public opinion, and partly because he and his people do not believe polling data. They look at the polls before the election and they conclude that they are not reliable indicators of the fundamental popularity of the president. Obviously, the second order effects are important. China will not accept that its trade volumes have to crash, so it will look for other outlets, either to divert trade to the United States through third countries or to third country markets. And that's obviously a particular concern to the EU, which is a very important market for China. And that relationship, I think, for both sides will become more important and also difficult. Just to point out the obvious, the net effect of this is negative on global growth. So the IMF downgraded global growth forecasts last month for the US, for the Eurozone, for the UK and other economies. That's certainly a 25-26 effect, and we will see what happens in following years. There are some silver linings. Oil prices are down, both because of the growth expectations and because of OPEC's decision to turn the taps on. So trading at roughly $60, I think, the last time I looked, well down from the post-Ukraine invasion heights. Markets think central banks are going to cut rates faster than they otherwise would. I just take that with a caveat. I think that's probably true in the Eurozone and in the country I know best, in the UK, because the impact on growth looks to be greater than the impact on inflation. In the US, it's much harder to call, and the Fed has flagged up their concerns about the inflation impact. And I think most expectations are that the Fed will wait to see what's going to happen before taking a decision. So I expect today the Bank of England will cut interest rates. I think the Eurozone will carry on its path. The US, I think, is less clear. There could also be a reaction in trade terms. My overall view is the world is going to be a higher tariff world as a result of what's happening. And the hopes that many of us had 20 years ago about moving to a zero tariff world are now over. But there will be some reaction, and some countries seeking to lower tariffs as a reaction. So yesterday, the UK and India announced that they had done a trade deal. I'm sure the European Union's trade negotiators are looking for every opportunity with their trade partners to promote their trade agreements. I suspect most of those will be bilateral rather than multilateral, but I don't rule out that in time countries might seek to liberalize trade between them as a reaction to what the United States is doing. Let's talk a bit about security. I think although a lot of the focus at the moment is on tariffs, the greater concern to many European governments is the security concern. This is the first American president in my working lifetime, and I think since the Second World War, who does not share the fundamental conviction of American presidents about the values of allies, about the value of allies and the US security system. For this president, they're as much a burden as an asset, and he thinks that many countries have been benefiting unfairly from the US security guarantee. He has a point on defence spending, but I believe, as I think many internationally do, that this has also benefited the United States. That is not the president's view. If you look at his behaviour, yes, he's quite cautious about getting into military conflict, is my experience, but he's very prepared to threaten it, and particularly towards countries who are more allied or closer to the United States. So that's why I think we've seen the targets of his attention in the first weeks and months as being Panama, Greenland, Denmark, and Canada, more than you've seen them being, say, China or Russia or Iran, where he is seeking an accommodation if he can. His opposition to multilateralism is clear. I think US withdrawal from a number of multilateral institutions and taking a different approach to the previous administration in others, which is going to be a problem for them and for other board members like the United Kingdom or European governments. I think the big question is what happens to the multilateral system if the United States is absent or opposed to it? Can it survive? And if so, in what form? My own view is that there are enough countries who think that the multilateral institutions are valuable, that they can continue in some way, shape or form. And we'll see a test of that later this year at COP30 as to whether China and other countries can, as it were, keep the show on the road. A word on climate change. I think this will mainly damage the United States rather than the overall global climate efforts. Deregulation and an ending of subsidies and tax credits will be far more important than what the president has said he wants to do in terms of oil and gas licensing. I don't think that will have a material effect because oil and gas producers are not state-owned companies. They're not charities. They will pump if it makes sense. And with oil prices low, it doesn't really make sense to expand production. The overall effect for the United States will be to slow the pace of the transition, but it won't stop it. And the gap between the United States and China in terms of clean technology will grow. For those operating in both markets, it's obviously going to be uncomfortable because you're going to have to speak out of both sides of your mouth. I don't see, although there will be some rollback, as you've seen in Europe, on reporting risk and disclosure, fundamentally, I think the commitment to the net zero transition is quite deeply rooted in Europe and in China, and broadly speaking, will continue. On security, Europeans are at least obviously concerned about Russia, but also now concerned about the United States, because I think the fear has become reality that the United States cannot be relied upon. That's certainly true of this administration, but a growing concern, I think, that this is not an aberration and that this might be a feature of the Republican Party for some time, and that European security cannot depend on the decisions of a few voters in swing states in the United States. So I think this is quite a profound shift in how European leaders are thinking about the role of the United States in Europe and their own security. Now, as a result, I think you're seeing an uptick in defence spending. That's certainly true in many countries, including my own. The biggest change is obviously in Germany. That chart on the right, I think, just brings in the scale of the stimulus package that was announced by incoming Chancellor Merz when he amended the debt brake in March. Very significant levels of fiscal expansion above all, but not only, but particularly for defence. European Commission is also, I seem to have lost you. I'm hoping you can hear me. I will continue. European Commission has announced increases in spending. Macron is talking about the European dimension of France's nuclear umbrella. So net, Trump seems to have had a stimulus effect, and we will see at the NATO summit in July quite what that means in terms of European defence spending. But the direction of travel, I think, is clear. So in a way, Trump is getting what he wants, an increase in defence spending. But as ever in international relations, you have to be careful what you wish for, because I think if European governments conclude, as some of them are, that the United States is not the reliable partner they thought, then they will draw conclusions about that for their own interests. And that relates particularly to critical national infrastructure. So defence, obviously, but also digital, data, AI, tech. I think it will influence how governments think about their reliance on the United States. This is not a Russia-style decoupling. This is not even yet a China-style de-risking, but it is a significant change in how European governments think about the United States and their vulnerability and exposure. And I think that will endure. One positive effect, I think the UK and the EU progressively, cautiously will move closer together. We'll see that next week. Is it next week? Sorry, the 19th of May, when there's an EU-UK summit. I think there will be positive news out of that. It won't be economically significant. It will be marginal, but I think it will establish a strong platform for further cooperation and growing cooperation in the months and years to come. I don't think it will be straightforward. This is something that the UK and the EU want, but the UK probably more than the EU. And as we've seen in the discussions so far, where fish has been traded against security and defence, it's not going to be straightforward, and the UK cannot expect enormous favours. Lastly, I'm just going to say about Russia-Ukraine, because certainly being a very important issue, I'm aware, in Sweden's security policy and its politics as a whole. I think it's important to bear in mind what Donald Trump fundamentally wants and why he wants it. Fundamentally, he wants the Nobel Peace Prize. He has as long as I've known him, but he wants to normalize relations with Russia for all sorts of reasons. He wants to normalize political and economic relations with Russia. In order to do that, he needs some sort of ceasefire, or if not a ceasefire, then at least he needs to show that he tried and that Russia isn't to blame for the absence of one. That's why he's put a lot of pressure on Ukraine and not a lot of pressure on Russia, and in fact conceded a number of important points to Russia at the start of the negotiation. That has shifted slightly in the last 2 weeks. I think he's become a little frustrated with President Putin not giving him more, but his instincts are absolutely clear. When President Putin announced the 3-day ceasefire over Victory Day, which you're seeing at the moment, some in the administration said this is not serious and it's not enough. Donald Trump's reaction was to say, actually, this is quite a thing and it's a bigger thing and it's a more important thing than people are giving Putin credit for. So I think Putin is in a difficult position. He doesn't quite know what to do next. But Trump's instincts, I think, are where he wants to get to is clear. Whether he can get there is less clear. Last point, what's going to happen next? So a ceasefire of some sort, I would say, is a realistic possibility. I'm pretty doubtful about an enduring peace agreement. I don't think that the Russian-Ukrainian positions can be reconciled. And I think that will have implications for things like energy policy, sanctions policy in Europe. And this could become a significant source of tension between the United States and Europe in the run-up to the NATO summit. France and the UK are talking about military backstops and military support to Ukraine. I think some of that is overdone. I don't think there will be large numbers of European troops on the ground in Ukraine without a US security guarantee, which I think Trump is unlikely to give. And I think there will be, Trump is obviously very keen both to cancel US sanctions and to press the Europeans into removing their own sanctions. My reading of where European leaders are is they are very reluctant to do that in the absence of a just and lasting peace settlement, i.e. moves towards a ceasefire are not enough. And even if in the course of a ceasefire they are pushed to do more than they want, fundamentally I don't see a normalization of relations between Europeans and Russia anytime soon, or possibly actually for as long as anyone like Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin. That's probably enough from me. I'm very happy to take questions, Niklaus, or if you have any from the floor that you want to put to me, I'm all ears. I'm all yours.
Peter, thank you very much. That was fantastic. It was a lot to digest. A big applause from all of us. We only have time for 3 short questions. I'll start with the first one. And Peter, do you think we are at peak Trump, or do you think that things will calm down now? That's the big question here. What do you think?
Yes. No, I don't think we're at peak Trump, and I think it would be very dangerous to think that we are. I'd say there's two. The most immediate marker is his priority is to pass his budget. So that is the marker for him for this year, and I think that's where his priorities will be. And tariff policy has to be seen in the light of that. Will things calm down after that? It's possible they will settle, but I think this is fundamentally a disruptive president who wants to reorder American politics, American society, America's place in the world, and the international order. And for that, you need to be constantly campaigning and changing things. It's possible that the bond market or a correction at the midterms would give him food for thought. And I think we can all hope that. But as far as we're any of us making planning assumptions, what do we prepare for? I would not assume that things are going to quieten down and we can sort of in 6 or 12 months return to something like the status quo ante. So I think we should assume hope for the best, but plan for the worst would be my take.
Good. Well, another question. Sweden is part of the EU and now also part of NATO, however, not part of the Eurozone. So any implications for Sweden, given that we are in Sweden now?
Look, I think, Sweden in some respects in economic terms is in a similar position to the country I know best, the UK, export-oriented economy, does a lot of trade with the United States as well as Germany, and so is and has traditionally had an open economy and favoured free trade, and so is quite exposed to the move against free trade, increasing protectionism, weakening of the WTO, and that's going to hit growth. That's obviously going to hit Swedish growth this year, probably next year. It's going to lead to some difficult decisions. Let's look on the positive side. So if you look at Sweden's macroeconomic position, it's broadly positive, more fiscal headroom than many countries. So your base is solid. I think there is a world of opportunity, actually. I don't say it's guaranteed, but it is possible that this is going to be the spur to European competitiveness, to integration of the single market that only Donald Trump could give. So I think the German stimulus is going to be an opportunity for many countries, including for Sweden, given your trading relationship. It's going to have an impact in Europe over time. I think Europe's attractiveness as a place of stability and reliability is obviously weighing with investors in a way that it wasn't even 3 months ago. The opportunity for the European Union, for Europeans to do some of the things that are in the Draghi report is now there in a way that it was not 3 or 6 months ago. And Sweden is reasonably well placed, I think, in some of those sectors. Obviously, defence is the main area where public investment is going to go. But in critical national infrastructure, in digital, in data networks, in telecoms, I think there will be there's more possibility of a European preference, European integration, growing European markets than there was 3-6 months ago. I'm not saying it's inevitable. We all know European politics very well, and there are many reasons that it might not happen. But that world of opportunity is now there in a way that it wasn't. And lastly, I would say enlargement. Sweden, I think, like the United Kingdom, has long been a champion of enlargement, and that was effectively dead for over a decade. That is now very much alive, and I think over the next decade, the European Union will enlarge. Ukraine is obviously the biggest question mark in that, but I think the geopolitical situation has reignited a commitment to enlargement, which I think will endure. So I think some positives in that. And as I say, Sweden, like all of us, is going to be hit in the short to medium term. But you have a reasonably, seems to me, stable platform and some sectors and some industries that are well placed to benefit from the opportunity, as I say, not the inevitably, of progress in European competitiveness and the single market.
Yeah. And our final question, just a short wrap up, going back to Europe and companies doing business in Europe. Where can we see the winners? Short and crisp, Peter. Where do we see the winners in Europe?
Defence, telecoms, data, digital, infrastructure. I think those are all obvious sectors where, at least as I read it, investors are interested, governments are interested, and there's a real European need. As I say, none of this is inevitable. But it's open in a way that it was not even 6 months ago. Is that crisp enough?
Yeah, that's very crisp. So, Peter, thank you very much, and give Peter a big applause.